Hello, dearly beloved. My name is Reverend Father Michael Mensah. I'm a priest of the Catholic Archdiocese of Accra and the chaplain of the St. Thomas Aquinas Chaplains here at the University of Ghana, Legon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Lenten Catechesis 2025, in which we shall be journeying together on the themes of Lent and the Jubilee. I invite you to walk with me during this period. I invite you to pray along with me, and may this Lent and this Jubilee year be a time of incredible grace for you and for your families. In this first edition, I'd like to welcome you once again and to ask you to join me and reflect with me as we discuss the Jubilee year and the season of Lent. You know that we've just begun the season of Lent. Lent being that 40-day period in the life of the church, intense period of preparation towards the celebration of Easter, in which we focus on the three cardinal practices of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. But how is all of this related, especially to the Jubilee year, this year 2025, this special time during the church's life, when the Pope has invited all of us to reflect on the theme Pilgrims of Hope? The first thing I want to do is to reflect with you on what exactly is the Jubilee year. Well, first and foremost, the Jubilee year is a tradition within the Catholic Church which actually began around the year 1300 under Pope Boniface VIII. Pope Boniface VIII, around 1300, decided to institute what has come to be known as the Jubilee year, a special time of grace in which the Church opens up her abundant treasures to all its faithful. This used to be celebrated once every 100 years, that's every century. But with time, the Jubilee year came to be celebrated every 50 years. And in more recent times, it has come to be celebrated every 25 years. Apart from these occasions in which the Jubilee year is celebrated, there are sometimes also what we know as special Jubilee years. So for instance, in 2015, you remember, we celebrated the year of mercy, which was a special or extraordinary Jubilee year. Otherwise, it's 25 years. So 1975 was the Jubilee year, the year 2000 was a Jubilee year, and this year 2025 is another Jubilee year. So what really is the meaning of the word Jubilee? The word Jubilee comes from a Hebrew word, yovel, which actually refers to a ram's horn. So it's more a bit of an onomatopoeia. For instance, you see how when a ram's horn is blown as a horn, it goes yo, that kind of noise, and which is also a sign of gathering. It's an invitation for people to gather in a very solemn way. But gathering for what? Gathering for a particular reason, and that is for deep reflection and for a change, if you like, in direction. So the Jubilee year is a year of great favor, and it is a year of great grace. It's a year in which all of us are supposed to unite to tap into the great graces that God has for us. In fact, another way of referring to the Jubilee year is the year of favor from the Lord. And that is why every Jubilee year is a very special occasion for the Church. And the Pope invites us, therefore, to travel together, this time under the theme, Pilgrims of Hope. Well, the Jubilee year is actually rooted in the Bible. The classical text where you can read about the Jubilee year is in the book of Leviticus, especially Leviticus chapter 25. Now, ideally, in the book of Leviticus, you'd read that it was supposed to be celebrated after the 49th year. So 49, as you realize, is 7 times 7. And you know that the biblical number 7 was a very important number, the number of the Sabbath. So in the Jubilee year, which was the 49th year, into the 50th year, the Leviticus chapter 25 specifies a number of things that were supposed to be done. One of the things, for instance, was that everyone was supposed to go back to their homes, where they came from. If you like, they had to go to their hometowns. Another thing people were supposed to do during the Jubilee year was not to till the land. Nobody was supposed to farm. And if for instance, there were fruits that were growing on the trees, that is what you would feed on, so that the land itself would have a certain period of rest. Another practice during the Jubilee year was to forgive debts. So if anyone owed anyone during the Jubilee year, those debts were supposed to be forgiven. In fact, if anybody had borrowed anything from another person, the person was supposed to give it back to the person in the Jubilee year. Or if, for instance, somebody had sold themselves out as a slave because times were hard, during the Jubilee year, all those debts, were supposed to be cancelled, and slaves were supposed to be given remission to go back where they came from. So Leviticus chapter 25, if you want to read about the Jubilee year, is the place where we ought to go. But I have to say that even that passage in Leviticus chapter 25 is underlaid by two other important passages of Scripture. To be able to understand the Jubilee year very well, we would first need to go into the book of Exodus chapter 20. And if you remember in the book of Exodus chapter 20, reading from verses 8 and following, it really speaks about the Sabbath. What is supposed to happen on the Sabbath? If you read it, it says that on the Sabbath day, no one is supposed to do any work. Why? Because the Lord rested on the Sabbath. And therefore, no one, whether the person was a slave or free, even animals, were not supposed to work on the Sabbath day. Now, that is one of the principles that underlies the Jubilee year. In the Jubilee year, people were not going to work because the Jubilee year was the great Sabbath, 49 meaning 7 times 7. So people were not supposed to work in the Jubilee year because it was the great Sabbath year. God rested on the 7th day, and therefore on the 49 times 49th year, which is on the 7 times 7th year, which is 49, nobody was supposed to work. And that was the basic principle underlying rest in the Jubilee year. The other idea is found in the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Deuteronomy, especially chapter 5, and if you continue reading from verses 12 and following, you realize that there was a second reason why the Sabbath was supposed to be observed. You read from that passage, what it mentions is that we celebrate the Sabbath because God was the one who freed the people of Israel out of their slavery in Egypt. And by freeing them from slavery and giving them freedom, no Israelite was supposed to be held as a slave. And this is the second principle that underlies the Jubilee year in Leviticus chapter 25. The people of God are free, and therefore they cannot be held in bondage. The Jubilee year is actually also a time of freedom, a time of liberation. God is liberating his people. God is setting his people free. And that is another of the important themes that we celebrate in the Jubilee year. Can the idea of the Jubilee year be found also in the New Testament? Yes, indeed. If you read from Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, and reading from verses 16 and following, you remember there is an episode in which Jesus went to Nazareth. And when he went there, he went on the day of the Sabbath into the synagogue, and we are told the scroll of the book of Isaiah was handed him, and he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of favor from the Lord." Now, that mention of the year of favor is actually what we're calling the Jubilee year. Now, what exactly did Jesus proclaim? Jesus went to Nazareth to proclaim liberty, and he spoke about it. He said to proclaim good news to the poor, liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and liberty to those who are oppressed. If you remember, these are the same things that we mentioned about the book of Deuteronomy chapter 5. It is about liberating. It's about setting captives free, about people who are in bondage going free. And that is exactly what Jesus goes to do in Nazareth. You'll also remember that we mentioned that one of the things that is expected of the Jubilee year is for a person to go home. And that is actually why Jesus went to Nazareth, because Nazareth was home for him. But what then is the implication of this in the New Testament? Who are these captives being set free? Who are these slaves being liberated? Who are the oppressed being liberated? Above all, we understand in the New Testament that there is no oppression that is more terrible than sin. There is no oppression that is more binding, more devastating than the effects of sin in our lives. And that is why in the Jubilee year, we are not only emphasizing physical bondages such as sickness or disease or possession, so on and so forth, but above all, we are talking about being free, being liberated from the bonds of sin. This is why the Jubilee year is so relevant to the question of Lent. In the season of Lent, what are we doing? We are struggling, we are making war against the bondage of sin and hoping that even as we die with Christ during this period, we shall rise with him at Easter. And the Jubilee year is also the time of great liberation, great freedom from all our bondages. But above all, as the New Testament teaches us, it is the bondage of sin that we are struggling against. So then, what is the relationship between Lent and the Jubilee year? Well, first and foremost, we are saying that the Jubilee year has to do with liberation. It has to do with setting captives free. It has to do with getting people out of their bondages. And isn't that the same thing that Lent has to do with? Lent is also the period in which we are struggling against the most severe bondage that a person can get into, and that is the bondage of sin. Lent is supposed to afford us the tools to be able to free ourselves from the things that hold us bound, and especially the sins that have become our masters. And so just as the Jubilee year is the great time for liberation, the great time for setting captives free, and as Jesus said, he has come so as to proclaim that year of favor, that year of Jubilee, in the same way, during the Jubilee year, during this most favored year, we are struggling, we are fighting to be able to come out of the bondage of sin. And that's why in this Lenten season, we're going to use the same traditional tools of prayer, of fasting, and of almsgiving to be able to get out of the bondage, the things that hold us bound. And that is why in the Jubilee year, we cannot do first and foremost without prayer. Prayer is the first tool in our struggle against sin. We remember that when Jesus was tempted in the desert, it says that he had been praying. He had been praying and fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. And it is during this time of prayer, this time of intense union with God, that Satan comes to tempt him. But because of that prayer, he is able to overcome the temptation that comes against him. And that is why the Jubilee year is a favorite time for prayer. One of the things that we're being asked to do in the Jubilee year, for instance, is to do pilgrimages, to go to places of prayer. This is one of the things that was characteristic of the Jubilee year. Jesus went to Nazareth, the place where he was born. The Jews were expected to go to their hometowns. And we ourselves are supposed to make pilgrimages. The Pope has invited those who are able to go to Rome, to the Vatican, on pilgrimage to St. Peter's Basilica. But even here in our diocese, the Archbishop has invited us to make pilgrimages to the cathedral. We can also make pilgrimages to various holy sites, to various grottos, and pray, and use this opportunity to pray that God will break us out of the bondages that hold us bound. So that is the first thing. The Jubilee year and Lent are a reserved time of prayer. The second thing is that the Jubilee year and Lent have one thing in common. They both have almsgiving in common. One of the important aspects of the Jubilee year was consideration for the poor and the needy. In fact, that is the reason why if somebody was in debt to you during the Jubilee year, you were supposed to let those debts go. Almsgiving is one way of bringing people out of their bondages. People are indebted, people are in need, and to be able to give them back their self-dignity, we are being called to reach out unto them. The message of Lent, which is one of almsgiving, is also one of giving people back their dignity. by giving alms to people, we recognize that they too are children of God, and that we seek to restore them to the dignity with which they were created. And that is why during the Jubilee year and the season of Lent, one of the things that we shall be taking seriously is reaching out to those who are needy in our communities. The third aspect of the Jubilee year and Lent is the question of fasting. And here again, there is a very interesting connection between Lent and the Jubilee year. In the Jubilee year, even the land was supposed to fast. There was supposed to be no cultivation of the land. The land needed to rest. And in the same way, in Lent, we ourselves are supposed to learn to fast. We're supposed to pull back from the things that God has created, which are ordinarily good for our use, and yet we set them aside for a certain spiritual purpose. So during the season of Lent, especially this Lent of the Jubilee, we shall be as much as possible respecting the things that God has made. Food, drink, and any other thing that God has created. We shall set them aside for a higher purpose. And that purpose is for our own spiritual well-being. And that is why during this Jubilee year, we shall make fasting a cardinal principle in this Jubilee year. Dearly beloved, I want to thank you for spending this time with me in our study on Lent and the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year, as I have said, is a great time of grace. It's a year of favor. It's the year in which the church also opens her doors so that the faithful can come in and feed on all the abundant graces that God has given to us. It is a time of great fervor because it falls also and coincides with this great season of Lent. And we are struggling so that during the season of Lent, we can come out of the bondages in which we find ourselves, the bondage especially of sin. This ties in with the message of the Jubilee year. It's time for us to benefit from this year of favor and to be free from the things that hold us bound. For that reason, the Pope has given us a message, and that message is that we should reflect on the Jubilee year as pilgrims of hope. And he says in Romans chapter 5 verse 5, and this hope does not disappoint. And that is why in the subsequent sessions, especially the next session, I will be inviting you to reflect with me on what is hope in the Jubilee year and what is hope in the season of Lent. I hope you have enjoyed this session, the Lenten Catechesis, this first session, and I invite you to join me again next week as we delve into the question of hope. What is hope? Join me next week for the next edition. Once again, I'm Reverend Father Michael Mensah.